Hi everyone, my name is Mark and I chose Centro Cultural de Raza in Balboa Park as the site for my project. Just a little bit of background. I've been curious about this cultural center for a little over a year. Last summer I had tried to pay a visit, but was kind of told when I walked through the doors that it was kind of closed off. I forget if it was a weekday, but it was closed off for kids in summer school and in summer camp. So, it was kind of cool to just come back and pay to visit and finally check it out. So Centro, it serves as a home that, doesn't divide people of any community, like Gloria Anzalda mentions in Borderlands. We have murals that reflect the Chicano movement, history, and significance by simply just existing. When there was a time when Chicanos and their culture weren't given a lot of time and space to coexist peacefully with Americans. Chicanos having space to call their own, to display their history is very significant. Here's a picture of me chilling with this power box that I personally liked. Kind of reminds me of a giant Olmec head. I think that those statues are pretty astounding. So it was cool to find this little piece right here. Just a cool way to blend it in with the artwork that's kind of surrounding the building. Okay, so historical context. So for historical context, the Chicano movement had goals such as reclaiming land, ending racism, improving labor conditions, having educational equality, voter rights, and just recognition of Mexican heritage. The Centro Cultural de la Raza has a role of one of the few places in San Diego that offers classes and events about indigenous, Mexican, and Chicano culture year-round for a little over 50 years. When you think about what Carlos Munoz Jr. From the Chicano movement mentions, that schools were segregated and Spanish-speaking only students would be sent to special education classes for not speaking English. Kind of makes you realize that the progress that's been made over the years by Centro, in states like California. For someone who's only lived in San Diego for about 4 years, I think it's important that the site exists. Combining past knowledge learned in this class and my personal knowledge of the city today, I just think that after all the hardships that Mexicans, indigenous and Chicanos endured, starting with the Mexican-American War, I think it's a miracle that their culture gets to exist here. It's an important site that keeps culture and history alive for future generations. All right. Now it's time to analyze the mural that's outside. I'm going to be going from left to right to the best of my ability. As you can see here, the text I wrote in the slide, this mural is called Geronimo, and it was created by Victor Ochoa. So when I look at this mural, I see two things. I see the timeline of indigenous, Mexican, and Chicano history. In the background, which I'll go into detail. I see 2 instances of collision. Okay, so with what's more easily visible, I'm gonna start with the left. So what we see here is a goddess hovering in front of the moon and an indigenous man looking towards her direction. One thing to notice is that the goddess looks like on the bottom by her legs that she has a rattler, like a rattlesnake. And after typing this up online, the results that pulled up lead me to believe that this could be the Aztec goddess known as Coatlique, and that means serpent skirt. At least right here, her depiction looks really lovely compared to what I saw online. Almost kind of like a scary Medusa. But, she represents creation, destruction, and rebirth. I don't know if you can kind of make out the 3 stars in between the indigenous man and her, but kind of makes me think that maybe he's praying to her and maybe wishing for something. All right, and as the mural continues, we see the sun shining and depictions of culture, tradition, and strength. Whether it's the man working on pottery or the woman dressed up for Dia de los Muertos, or the couple dancing in their traditional attire. The sun is shining on Mexican tradition and culture beautifully. At the center of it all, we have a man on a knee with a rifle in hand. Upon looking this up, I found that he is a famous Apache warrior known as Geronimo, hence the name of the mural. And I think him being kind of front and center of the whole mural is intentional. I believe he's meant to show anyone that passes by that has ties to Mexico over the generations. He's meant to show that, we have strength, and kind of shows our resilience and resistance. And, I think the rifle is meant to show protection for everything that's indigenous, Mexican, and Chicano. On the right portion of the mural, it looks like we could possibly have a first-generation immigrants. And we have what looks like some young students on the right side. Everyone on this side of the mural is looking towards a corner that has like these half circles that are in various traditional colors that are kind of flowing towards them. If we kind of look at the first generation immigrants here with guitars in their hand, and one of the children having a book and a pencil. I think everyone's looking for and celebrating for a better tomorrow. All right, to break this mural down a little further, it's all in the details. So I said that these 2 pieces in the background are displaying collision. The fist fir pillars underneath the Coronado Bridge. I think they represent the stand that Chicanos took when they found out that they weren't going to get a park that they were promised. In the end, it all worked out, and Chicano Park was born. You know, the picture on the right, the road behind Geronimo. It's kind of my favorite because the road actually kind of leads back to Centro. Kind of solidifying its place in history. To the left we have skyscrapers, and then to the right of it we have some pyramids you see in Mexico. I think it's just representing a place where past and present come together to give history. I think that themes in this mural are relevant today as we continue to acknowledge indigenous tribes and the land we use that was once theirs. The fight for equality, and to have spaces that are indigenous, Mexican, and Chicanos that they can call their own in the U.S. continues. Generations are going to keep immigrating to the U.S., which means history, traditions, and culture will need to be kept alive. So indigenous, Mexican, and Chicanos don't lose their identities. I don't know if I could say that I learned something significantly new visiting the site, but, I've had realizations over the past few months that the importance of preserving history. There's weight for me that's been added when I think about the challenges that indigenous Mexicans and Chicanos have faced throughout history, and I'm glad that I see things a lot more clearly. I felt almost every emotion in these past 2 semesters taking Chicano studies courses, just learning about the history. I personally don't like confrontation, but I realize that the resistance that has been given from indigenous Mexican and Chicanos, it's played a big part into a lot of positive changes that needed to happen. Problems this serious can't be solved with silence. So, everyone that goes out and protests, they play a really important part of history, for past, present, and future. Like Luis Valdez says at the end of Zoot Zoot, the Pachucho spirit lives within many of us Mexican Americans. The fight for social justice, it needs to continue. To conclude, I think Geronimo will stand the test of time. My hope is that Centro lives on, hopefully for another 50 plus years and beyond. I hope that Geronimo gets restored when needed. A legacy was created at Centro and at Chicano Park. It's important to keep it alive so that indigenous Mexican and Chicano communities have places in San Diego to celebrate their traditions. I hope that this mural inspires future generation artists to not only paint, but to learn, to respect, and to pass on that legacy. It takes a village to protect something so precious. With that realization, I personally plan to brainstorm once the semester is over, just ways that, I can contribute to this community. And, I have so much to learn, and, and hopefully plan to one day share. That way I can honor those who did it before me. So, thank you to Victor, and thank you to everyone who watched this video.
Thank you so much and have a good day.